so I kind of had to improvise. And just before I pulled it into the unit, I noticed this. This sort of clear film which is over the paint here is called paint protection film. So the previous owner obviously looked after it, and it should have protected the paint pretty well. So before I brought it into the unit, I wanted to give it a quick wash with the MA detailing stuff. Right, now we need to figure out how to get this thing in the unit. So we've got the Aston just about in the door of the unit. And then we have to give a shout out to Malibu Performance for letting us steal the wheel skates. You can put them underneath the wheel, jack the wheel up, and then just slide the car around. It's as easy as that. Now the Aston's going to be going on the smaller blue ramp because we have the Lamborghini in the big ramp, which is, well, fairly poorly to say the least. But we'll get onto that in a future video. Okay, so finally the Aston is touched home inside the unit and we can begin the actual rebuild. The one thing that I want to start off with is to figure out why this wheel is, well, not connected to anything. And I have suspicions that maybe there's a broken track rod end in there, but let's get this wheel off and we'll investigate further, and then we can start stripping this car to bits and find out what we need to buy for it. Oh my god.
Is that light?
They are so light. This is the lightest wheel, 19-inch wheel I've literally ever felt. It is, oh my days. They've got to cost a fortune. And they're looking good nick as well, so could be onto a winner there. So as I suspected, we have a broken inner tie rod. The actual track rod end seems okay and the ball joint seems fine. We just have snapped off the inner tie rod, which is pretty lucky actually because all the suspension arms look okay, and I can't imagine the suspension arms being cheap. The brake disc looks okay, the brake pads are good, the caliper's good. It looks in really good nick actually, but just the inner tie rod to replace. So I got straight on the phone to the local parts shop to see if they can order an inner tie rod for the Aston Martin. And whilst I waited for them to get back to me, I started stripping apart the rest of the damaged parts on the front. Now during this time they actually gave me a call back to say that they can't get an inner tie rod for an Aston Martin, no one lists them, so it's a main dealer only part. So I had to call Aston Martin.
Thank you for calling Aston Martin Nottingham.
It's a front inner tie rod, it's the driver's side, the F side.
Pretty confident that's not sold separately.
Oh.
So I'll double check for you now. Yeah, so the cap is separate.
Right.
But the rest of that is all the rack. And the rack on one of these is £5,880, 13 pence plus the VAT.
Jesus Christ. Okay.
Right.
Cheers, mate.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye. Okay, so we've got a first problem here. So yeah, you heard it right. Aston Martin don't sell an inner tie rod separately. You have to buy the full steering rack. So I went ahead and started removing the inner tie rod just to see if I could see any part numbers that were on there. I was hoping that if I could find a part number, I could maybe compare it to something that they used on another car. And when I got the inner tie rod off, there was some numbers which were stamped on there. And if these numbers didn't work, I was just going to measure the inner tie rod and see if I could find one similar. But literally, I think after about 5 minutes of Googling that part number, I think we've found one. Just from a quick Google of the little part number that was on this inner tie rod, it seems they use the same inner tie rod, well I hope they use the same inner tie rod, as a Jaguar XF. So I'm going to call up the parts place now with an XF registration, order an inner tie rod, and then fingers crossed that will work.
My God. Can't take my eye off you.
So that's one Jaguar XF inner tie rod on order, which costs £16. We just have to wait now to see if it fits. The next step is to start stripping apart this whole front end, get all the damaged parts off so we know exactly what next we need to order. Now there's a lot of parts which make up this front end, and I've got a feeling that we might not be able to cross-reference all of them because a lot of them will just be specifically made for the Aston Martin. But we'll see how we get along. Now it's safe to say we've definitely repaired worse. And if this was an Audi, a Volkswagen or a BMW, this would be a nice, quick and easy job. It's just the fact that it's an Aston Martin, and that's what's going to be the hard part about this whole build. Okay, so I think it looks a lot worse than it actually is, but you can see why these cars actually get written off. Now, we are slowly getting there. There's still a lot more damaged parts that need to be taken off, like the arch lining and the bonnet, and there's also a wing that's damaged on the other side as well. But we've slowly started stripping apart the front end. But an accident damage repair centre, if they were going to repair this under like insurance circumstances, they'd have to replace everything like for like OEM. So example, that inner tie rod that we just spoken about, that couldn't be replaced with the Jaguar XF tie rod, although it is exactly the same. Well, we hope it's exactly the same. They'd have to get a steering rack from Aston Martin, which we all know is £5,800 plus VAT, then the labour cost to fit it, and then that's just even the start of things. You've got the rest of this to sort of go on with. Here is another perfect example here. Remember the pyrotechnics fuse, which at the minute we're bridging this sort of circuit across so we can get it started? Well, this thing is here. Now, if you remember in the first episode, I told you that Aston Martin won't actually sell to the public parts which are to do with safety, like the crash cans on the front and some parts with the airbag. They'll only sell those parts to an Aston Martin registered repair centre, just because they want their cars to be top notch when they're back on the road and not repaired by, well, someone like me. But I did call them regarding a pyro fuse, but it comes as a whole unit like this, and this thing from Aston Martin is £560. And this is kind of annoying because we don't actually need that full part, we only need this little fuse here. Well, I actually managed to find that full pyro fuse kit on eBay secondhand for £289.99, which is still pretty expensive, and we only need that fuse part. But again, we're using our brain here, and on the actual pyrotechnics fuse, the actual part that we need, there is a small part number, and that part number relates to a fuse which is also used on Audi Q5s, Maseratis, BMW 3 Series, 5 Series, 6 Series, 7 Series, and the best bit about it, you can buy it separately off eBay for £27.99. We've just got to hope that all these cross-referenced parts all work, and we won't know that until they turn up. Now, there's a fair few damaged radiators on the Aston Martin. The one in front of the passenger wheel isn't leaking, but it is damaged, and the oil cooler in front of the driver's wheel seems okay, but the rest of the radiators and the aircon rads, well, they seem to have taken a bit of a beating. The main radiator here, which is huge, looks okay, but at the bottom it's actually leaking coolant, so we're gonna have to order one of these. And just to keep track of all the parts and the expenses on this build, I've got myself a blackboard and a special shout out section on the side for people that help me out, like Mallory Performance with the wheel skates and Aston Martin with telling me how to knock the car into neutral without starting it. Now, there's another huge question here, and that is the chassis bent? And if it is, the build is going to get that much more expensive. Now, pretty much most of the chassis on this is aluminium and unboltable, which is why I had a fair amount of confidence in this, but I won't really find out the good or bad news until I remove these front crash cans. And the news is good. Well, it's good so far. So this is what they call a crash can. This is a sort of crumple zone. This bit here is designed to sort of squash up when involved in a front end accident, but I don't think the impact was really that way. It was more of a that way accident, and in this instance it sort of broke away from the weld, but it's a good job it has broke away from the weld, because if that weld held up, then we could be talking a lot more damage than we originally thought. So this is where the crash can bolts to, on that side and on that side, and because it broke away from the weld, I'm thinking that this part should still be in a straight line. If that weld held up, then it could have pushed it all to one side, but you can see there's a lot of brace in here which is all straight. This is an unboltable part as well, and there's no kinks, there's no bends or anything in that. So as far as I can see from my eyes, this is all in a straight line, and all this aluminium sort of subframe is all unboltable, but you're talking like engine out job to change it. But again, I'm no professional and I don't claim to be, so saying that that the car's not been knocked out of geometry just by looking at it by eye would be like a silly claim. So it's definitely going to go and have an alignment when everything's all bolted back together. But actually, by looking at it, it really doesn't look that bad. I think it's going to be little parts like this broken piece here that's going to end up jumping up and biting me, because we can't cross-reference that to another car. And, well, it's an Aston Martin only part because it's only made for this chassis. And, well, we all know how Aston Martin prices go. And also from such an amazing response from the last video, which I can't thank all you guys enough for watching the video, liking it and sharing it. And also, if you're new here and you've recently subscribed, welcome aboard. The previous owner of the Aston Martin actually reached out to me, and we have the photos from the accident. It's been a long time coming, but oh yes, is it going to be worth it? As we've discovered, finding parts for a 2019 Aston Martin Vantage isn't one of the easiest things in the world. This Vantage came free with a damaged front end, a damaged bonnet, a lot of damaged radiators, which we took off in the last video, a damaged wheel arch lining, and both airbags deployed. But looking on the bright side of things, I bought this car as a non-runner, and we actually managed to get it started without spending, well, pretty much any money. And in the last video, I started stripping apart the front end to find out what's damaged and what isn't damaged, and we found out parts are a little harder to find than we first thought. Take this inner tie rod as an example. When I bought the car, we found that the inner tie rod had completely snapped. The inner tie rod is the part that connects the steering rack to the track rod end, which allows the wheel to steer when turning the steering wheel. Now, nobody else could get an inner tie rod for an Aston Martin, so we had to call Aston Martin directly. They said they wouldn't sell them separately. They only come as a full steering rack, which was around £5,800.
£5,880, 13 pence.
There is no way I'm paying £5,800 just for a steering rack, which I just need the inner tie rod for. So I looked at the steering rack, found a part number on it which matched to a Jaguar XF inner tie rod. Which brings me to this situation. So this tie rod is off a Jaguar XF, and although it does thread into the steering rack and also it threads into the track rod end, it is just too short to what the actual tie rod off the Aston Martin is. Now this inner tie rod right here is off a Focus ST, and it is the right length, it's just the pitch on the thread is just not quite right. Now this one is off a Mercedes C-Class. This was £14, and this does thread into the track rod end. It is a little bit longer than the Aston Martin one, but we can trim it down, and it does thread into the steering rack-ish. Now this tie rod is all the way into the steering rack, and you can still see a gap between the actual tie rod and the steering rack. And if you look at the passenger side, well, it's completely flush against the steering rack. So the actual steering rack end is just not quite the same. And for me, I'm not willing to take a risk on something so vital as the steering. So on this certain part, I seem to have taken a loss on trying to avoid Aston Martin tax. Or have I? I have been shopping. Look at all the parts that we have here. Now I've got to do a huge shout out for so many of you that have reached out to try and help me find parts for this Aston Martin. And we've had breakers yards, race teams, and even people that used to work for Aston Martin try and help me with this. But most of this stuff here came from Cinetic, who are like a car auction / breakers yard, who are breaking an Aston Martin Vantage. And I managed to grab some of the scraps off it, including the inner tie rod. So a huge shout out to Craig from Cinetic, who reached out and told me about the Aston Martin that they had breaking, and the second-hand tie rod set me back £100. So Cinetic gets added to the blackboard, and you can see here just how close we were of dodging that Aston Martin tax. It was just a tiny bit too short on the Jaguar XF inner tie rod. All that's left to do now is to fit the second-hand inner tie rod to the Aston Martin. And it's just a simple case of screwing it into the steering rack and then screwing it into the track rod end. Now the car will need to have its wheel alignment done afterwards, but just as a rough guess, we're just measuring it with a tape measure for now. Now, although we didn't save loads of money on this inner tie rod, we still managed to save a bit buying it second hand. But with this next part, I think we're about to save a fair bit of money. And that is this part right here, which is the pyrotechnics fuse. Now this is a fuse which all of you guys know by now, which breaks when the airbags deploy, and you can just see the break in it at the bottom there. Now from Aston Martin, they want you to buy this whole piece here, which includes the pyrotechnics fuse, and the fuse actually sits between this bit and that bit there. Aston Martin again want around 580 quid for that full pyrotechnics fuse sort of thingy-majig. Now I found that full bit that Aston Martin wanted to sell me on eBay exactly the same for around 280 quid, which still seemed a little bit steep for just, well, a pyrotechnics fuse. So I actually looked at the part number on the back of this and found this, which is off of Volvo. Now this pyro fuse off of Volvo cost me £27.99, and it looks pretty much identical to the one that's came off the Aston. And I have no reason to believe why it wouldn't work, so let's fit it. So the reason the pyro fuse breaks in the first place when the airbags deploy is in case the accident is that bad that it causes a fire. And the pyro fuse is just there to cut power going directly to the engine. So obviously with that broken, the car won't start up. But we've learned by taking the pyro fuse off and jumping the cable over to the main electrics on the car, we can actually start it. But this isn't really a long-term fix, and it's quite dangerous to keep it like that. So hopefully with this new pyrotechnics fuse, we should be back in action. And this one, which just came off a Volvo, fits quite snug and exactly the same as the Aston Martin one fit. Okay, so that is a new pyro fuse on the car. I'm hoping that it works, but we can't actually test to see if it works or not because, well, we don't have a front end on the car, and starting it, well, it just cause havoc. Now, so far, we're not actually doing so bad on the parts side of things. But there is a few things, well, mainly one thing that I still cannot get. It seems to be as rare as anything, and believe me, I've searched everywhere for it. So let me show you the part that is impossible to find. The dashboard. Now as the passenger airbag has blown, it's ripped a huge hole in the dashboard, and it's also smashed the windscreen as well. Now this dashboard is impossible to find, and not only have I got to find one, I've also got